In Part 2, the mystery deepens. Queen Elizabeth names her serpent son Ezelu and raises him in secret as he displays eerie powers, speaking through dreams, sensing emotions, and drawing creatures near. But a blood-soaked scroll bearing his name and ancient symbols sparks fear. A prophecy is revealed. Ezelu will either save the kingdom or destroy it. As the king begins to turn against him, Ezelu begins to change, and the palace prepares for a power unlike anything it's ever known. The palace slept, but Queen Elizabeth was wide awake, wrapped in silence and secrets. The moon poured silver light to the lattice windows of her inner chamber as she knelt beside the silk-lined cradle where the creature coiled, watchful, motionless. Her voice trembled as she leaned close, barely a whisper escaping her lips. "Ezelu," she breathed, "born from the heavens." The name seemed to linger in the air, as if the very walls were listening. The serpent stirred. His golden eyes blinked slowly, locking on hers. That night, she named him not for what he was, but for what she hoped he could be. Each night after, she returned to him. After the servants retired, after the palace dimmed, her routine became sacred. She brought warm milk in an ivory bowl, hummed lullabies her mother once sang, and wiped the scales with cloth soaked in rose water. He never hissed, never bit. He only watched her with those unblinking, soul-deep eyes. At first, she found peace in the ritual. Then she noticed the way his gaze followed her every move. Not like a child watching a mother, but like a being far older, far wiser, studying her with eerie calm. When she paused, he blinked. When she whispered, he stilled. It was as though he understood. The queen began to dread the weight of those eyes. Even as she loved him, no one else knew his name. Not the maids, not the midwives, not even King Obiagelu. She had named him in the dark, and only the dark had heard her. And yet, sometimes when she stood to leave, the air behind her seemed to murmur the name back. Ezelu, almost like the shadows were practicing how to say it. It started with the birds. First, a single sparrow perched at Ezelu's window each morning, pecking gently at the pane. Then 3, then flocks. They didn't chirp. They didn't fly away. They simply watched. Silent witnesses. Then came the palace cats, fiercely independent creatures who usually scattered from humans. Now they curled around Ezelu's cradle as if guarding it. One even slept draped across the edge, purring low and steady. Servants whispered that the queen's chamber smelled like the wild. They didn't know how right they were. Snakes from the palace gardens began appearing next. Long, black, and sleek, they slithered beneath the curtains at night and coiled near the threshold of Ezelu's chamber. They never attacked, never hissed. They waited as if summoned. Elizabeth said nothing, but in her dreams, Ezelu began to speak. The first time, his voice was soft, childlike but firm. "Mother, why am I hidden?" She startled awake, breathless. Her hands clutched over her chest. The next night, "Why does father not love me?" The words echoed in her mind like bells rung underwater, muffled but haunting. She wept after that one. And somehow Ezelu knew. When she cried silently at her window, he slithered close and lay still beside her, brushing her fingers gently with his tail. When she was anxious, he stilled, pulsing warm from his coiled body. He was feeling her, not watching, feeling. Elizabeth began to wonder. He spoke no human words aloud, yet he knew more than any 7-year-old. His gaze held no confusion, only quiet comprehension, the kind that made her feel exposed. He was unnatural, yes, but not violent, not wild. Could it be? Could this child, this serpent with golden eyes, truly be a gift from the gods? Or was it simply a moment of calm before something terrible began to stir? The morning mist still clung to the palace grounds when the guard found it. He was making his usual rounds near the outer gate, half asleep, spear dragging the dirt, when his eyes caught a strange glint of red. He stepped closer and froze. A scroll, soaked in blood, was nailed into the wooden frame with a black, jagged dagger unlike any used in Ikeji Kingdom. The guard hesitated, then pulled it free with trembling hands. The parchment was thick, old, and cold to the touch. Etched across it in dried crimson were ancient Nsibidi symbols. He didn't recognize them all, but 2 were unmistakable. One was a symbol for chaos, the other rain, and carved between them in flawless script was a name he was never meant to see. Ezelu. His heart stuttered. He dropped the scroll. The chickens nearby squawked and scattered as he backed away. By the time he returned with help, the scroll was gone. Only the black dagger remained, sunk deep into the stone. Whispers spread like wildfire before noon. The gate was guarded double, but nothing could stop the fear from seeping through. In her chamber, Queen Elizabeth said nothing when she heard. She didn't ask questions. She didn't blink. But that night, as the palace darkened and the last footsteps faded from the hall, she slipped into Ezelu's chamber and gathered him into her arms. She held him longer than usual, tighter than usual. Not a word passed between them, but as he coiled softly around her waist, his golden eyes blinked slowly, knowingly. Someone out there had spoken his name, and they were watching. Queen Elizabeth rode out under moonlight, her identity buried beneath layers of cloth. Her royal purple was replaced with the coarse brown wrapper of a widow, and her crown lay hidden in a saddle pouch. No guards, no attendants, just urgency and fear. She traveled alone, past the thick trees and sacred stones, to the cave of the blind oracle of Erechukwu. Few dared seek the oracle. Few returned unchanged. But Elizabeth had no choice. She had named something she didn't understand. And now, the world was beginning to whisper that name too. The cave was thick with incense and ancient silence. The oracle, 89, Nigerian, dark skin, face drawn like carved wood, sat cross-legged, her milky eyes unfocused. Still, she turned as Elizabeth entered, as if she'd seen her long before she arrived. "You carry something not born of this world," the oracle murmured, "yet it clings to you like a child." Elizabeth's voice shook. "What is he?" The oracle reached for a bowl of powder and blew it into flame. Smoke danced, swirling upward, forming a vision. Ikeji Kingdom divided, one half lush, gold with fruit and laughter. The other burned, blackened to ash. In the center stood Ezelu, grown and glowing, arms spread as the kingdom split beneath his feet. "He will choose," the oracle said. "He must, to devour or to deliver." Elizabeth fell to her knees. "Can I stop it?" The oracle shook her head slowly. "Ezelu is both crown and curse. You gave him a name, but the world will give him purpose, and it will not let him remain hidden much longer." Outside, thunder rolled, and for the first time, Queen Elizabeth wondered if her love had birthed a savior or an ending. The council room of Ikeji Palace, once a place of celebration and strategy, grew darker with every whispered rumor. Word of Queen Elizabeth's secret retreat to the oracle spread like wildfire, twisted by mouths that feared what they didn't understand. Combined with a mysterious blood-stained scroll, it was all the council needed. "He is not a child," one advisor hissed behind closed doors. "He is a weapon, a curse disguised as a boy." Another leaned in, voice trembling. "If he sits on the throne, our bloodline ends with fangs and fire." They voted without vote. Fear made its own laws. King Obiagelu said nothing during those meetings, but he listened. The words clung to him like smoke, unshakable. At night, he no longer visited Elizabeth. He no longer asked for her. When her name was mentioned in passing, his jaw clenched. When Ezelu's was spoken, he turned away, and into that silence slithered a voice more dangerous than all. The rebel priest, Father Uzoki, approached the king one evening with a calm too calculated. "Majesty," he said softly, "the oracle is blind, but the gods are not. They've shown me things, his scales, his wings, his power." Obiagelu didn't respond. "He's not your son. He's a spirit, a creature. And spirits," the priest said, leaning closer, "do not love kings. They destroy them." The words took root. They festered. Obiagelu began to question what he once adored. The boy he never named. The queen who had defied him. And in the days that followed, his gaze toward Elizabeth turned cold, but his thoughts toward Ezelu turned colder still. The seventh night came cloaked in silence, as if the palace itself was holding its breath. Queen Elizabeth paced the floor, her bare feet whispering against the marble. She had cleared the wing of every servant, every torch. No one could see what was coming. But even with the doors bolted and guards turned away, she knew the change could not be hidden for long. In the center of the room, Ezelu lay motionless on his silken mat. His copper gold scales had begun to flake away like old paint. His body twitched, then arched violently, the first crack slicing to the quiet like a whip. Ezelu, Elizabeth breathed, falling to her knees. He convulsed again. More scales split. Steam hissed from his skin as something pushed outward. The room filled with the scent of smoke and salt. His arms stretched longer, fingers clawed and flexing from his back. Something tore through his sound like ripping cloth. Wings, wet and golden, stretching wide across the floor, glowing with living flame. His serpent tail thickened, darkened, took on a sheen like armor. Then the door creaked. 2 servants had wandered back, curious or careless. They saw him. One dropped a tray and ran, shrieking down the corridor. The other dropped to her knees, clutching a pendant, whispering frantic prayers. Elizabeth slammed the door shut behind them, breath trembling. The time for secrecy was gone. She turned back just as Ezelu opened his eyes, now brighter than ever, burning green like wildfire. The heat in the room rose with every breath he took. Then he spoke. "Mother," he said softly, deeply, "I am ready." Elizabeth froze. The words echoed, not just in her ears, but in the walls, in her chest. The very air thickened around him. Time seemed to bend. Ezelu no longer felt like a boy. He felt like a force awakening. She had barely begun to clean the spilled oil in the corridor when the servant broke. Shaking, sweat-soaked, and wide-eyed, she was dragged before King Obiagelu. Her lips trembled, but the words spilled out, of wings, of flames, of something no longer boy and not quite beast. The chamber fell silent. Obiagelu's eyes darkened. "You're sure?" he asked. She nodded once, then collapsed in sobs. That evening, the king summoned his war council. No bells rang. No horns blew. They gathered in the inner hall behind closed doors. The scrolls on the table were not maps of foreign lands, but blueprints of his own palace. Routes, entrances, weaknesses. "The queen," he said coldly, "and her son." Tonight, it was not an order. It was a sentence. But far across the palace, Ezelu lifted his head. The wind outside shifted. Inside the queen's chamber, the air grew thick. Elizabeth, seated near the window, felt her skin tingle. Then Ezelu turned toward her, his eyes flickering with emerald fire. "They're coming," he said. She stood. "What?" His voice was calm, too calm. "I feel their fear. It will burn them first." Elizabeth's breath caught. There was no child in that voice, no softness in that stare. Something ancient stared back at her through the eyes of the son she once rocked to sleep. She had always known he was different. But now, as her heart raced and the palace held its breath once again, she knew this truth with terrifying clarity. Ezelu was no longer hers to protect. He was no longer a secret to hide. He had become something else entirely. The night air was unnaturally still. In the farthest chamber of the palace, Ezelu stood by the window, his wings folded tightly behind him, his golden-scaled tail coiled beneath. He stared out into the courtyard, where the torches flickered despite the absence of wind. Shadows along the palace walls moved, slowly, deliberately, as if they no longer belonged to the people who cast them. Then the walls themselves began to glow. Faint lines of Nsibidi symbols shimmered across the stone, symbols no one had carved. They pulsed with light, alive and ancient. Ezelu's voice broke the silence, low and resonant. "I will not be hidden anymore." The words didn't just echo in the room. They echoed across space, across thought, across dreams. In her sleep, Queen Elizabeth stirred, her brow furrowed. In the dream, she stood before a ring of fire, and around her voices chanted in a language she didn't know, but understood. A name repeated again and again. Ezelu, Ezelu, Ezelu. Her eyes snapped open. Across Ikeji Kingdom, in farmlands and fishing huts, children cried out in their sleep. Elders sat up gasping. And all across the land, people whispered a nightmare shared, a vision of a golden serpent, massive and glowing, flying across a starless sky. eyes burning like suns. Back in the palace, the earth trembled. Dust rained softly from the ceiling. Ezelu turned from the window. His eyes glowed brighter than ever. His voice, barely a whisper now, vibrated the air itself. It's beginning. And as the stones beneath his feet warmed and the night began to groan, one truth gripped the air like a coming storm. Something was rising, and it was not going to ask permission. Ezelu is awakening. The kingdom senses it. The king prepares for war. But the queen knows it may already be too late to control what's been hidden for too long. To be continued. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when part 3 drops. You won't want to miss what happens next.